Hello and welcome to tonight's presentation entitled History, Race, and Collective Memory, the Case of White Southern Identity, presented by Dr. Ashley Thompson and Brendan Lannon. My name is Virgil Moore and I'm the chair of the Study Circle Planning and Support Committee. The mission of the Community Dialogue on Race and Racism is to create a racially equitable community where race and ethnicity are not predictors of success in any aspect of life, and where public policies, institutional practices, social structures no longer favor one group or people of color over another. The Community Dialogue began in 2007 in response to several community events which involved race and undertones of racism. The most notable of these events was the death of an African-American man by the name of Clarence Beard in the custody of white police officers. The culmination of these events led to community leaders to come together to begin the Community Dialogue on Race and Racism. Since that point, over 2,000 people have participated in the Community Dialogue, either as a study circle participant, facilitator, or in some other aspects, such as our summer film series, our fair housing workshop, our community dialogue survey, community forums, and presentations like this one tonight. The presentation tonight is one way that the community dialogue continues to increase awareness and education about race and racism in order to create a more racially equitable outcomes in our community. We hope you will enjoy tonight's presentation. Now we'll have our introduction of our speaker by Letitia Thornhill.
It's not a test this time. My name is Letitia Thornhill, and I'm also on the committee for the Dialogue on Race and Racism. Ashley Thompson is an assistant professor of sociology at Lynchburg College. She earned a bachelor's in sociology from the University of North Carolina at Asheville. Dr. Thompson earned her master's degree and doctorate in sociology from Vanderbilt University in 2007. Her central areas of research include the American South, race relations, and collective memory. She has a forthcoming publication in the journal Southern Cultures titled Race as Region, Region as Race, in which she examines how Black and white Southerners understand their regional identities. She has also co-authored an article with Larry J. Griffin, Social Class and Southern Identity, which will be published this year in the New Encyclopedia of Southern Culture, Volume 21, Social Class, by the University of North Carolina Press. Brendan Lannon graduated from Lynchburg College just a few weeks ago, earning his bachelor's in sociology with an emphasis on cultural studies. Brendan graduated magna cum laude. He also earned high honors in sociology after defending a research paper on the construction of Dixie and the songs of country singer Hank Williams Jr. In addition, Brendan received the Outstanding Student Award in Sociology, as well as being inducted into the Alpha Kappa Delta Honor Society in Sociology, the Phi Kappa Phi National Honor Society, and Omicron Delta Kappa, a prestigious national leadership society. Brendan was accepted into the Ph.D. program in sociology at the State University of New York, Stony Brook, where he will begin his graduate study in the fall. Dr. Thompson and Brendan have been working on research examining how white and Black Southerners remember the past. The lecture today is based on their work, some of which was presented at the 2012 Southern Sociological Society annual meeting this year in New Orleans. Join me in welcoming Ashley Thompson and Brendan Lannon.
All right. Hello, thank you all for coming out this evening, and thank you to Many Voices, One Community for sponsoring this event. So trying to figure out where to put my water and situate myself. So tonight, Brendan and I are going to talk some about white Southern identity and how white Southerners think about and remember the racial history of the South. And then we're also going to talk a little about some more recent research we've been doing for comparing white and Black Southerners' memories of the past. So one thing that's still apparent in the South is that most white residents in the South identify themselves as Southerners. The most recent study that looked at this were a series of Southern focus polls from 1991 to 2001. And at that time, roughly 75% of all whites living in the South identified as Southern. And many groups ground their identity in their thoughts about the history of the group they're a member of, how they think about that history. And also, as you might imagine, most people are motivated to see the groups they belong to in a positive manner. Yet, when you think about white Southerners, obviously there's a troubled history there in terms of issues of racial oppression of African Americans in the South. So, as you know, white Southerners were responsible for slavery, Jim Crow segregation, resistance to the civil rights movement. And so this creates a very difficult past for white Southerners to deal with when they're trying to think about their identity in the present. So one thing that we're interested in is how members of a group that has this type of difficult past can proudly claim to be Southern or think about this identity in a positive way. So before we get into more of the research and the findings, I just want to give you a little theoretical background. So this research is worked off of using social identity theory, which Henri Tajfel was the first person to talk about social identity theory in 1978. And basically he argued that people categorize the world into different social groups, and that those social groups tend to be differentially valued. So some groups are viewed more positively, some groups are viewed more negatively than other groups. So he talked about people's group memberships as having consequences for an individual's social identity. So your social identity, as he defined it, is that part of an individual's self-concept which derives from his knowledge of membership in a social groups or groups, together with the value and emotional significance that's attached to that membership. So essentially then social identities are personal identities. They're individual identities, but they're linked to the social groups you belong to. So the idea is that he's saying that all people are members of different groups. Ideally, they want to view these groups in a positive way. And if you're a member of a group that you think of positively, then you'll feel better about yourself and you'll have higher self-esteem if that's the case. All right, so Southern identity is an excellent case for looking at issues of social identity because of this problematic past that white Southerners in particular have, trying to think about how people still maintain a positive feeling about being Southern and trying to reconcile the past history of the South. So in the case of Southern identity, if you think about folks outside of the South and larger cultural productions, often Southerners have been thought of as a stigmatized group or a deviant group. Sometimes they've been thought of as a social problem. So you can think of, for instance, slavery as a social problem to America, or the civil rights movement and the actions of white Southerners as a social problem. And in larger culture, you often hear things about Southerners being racist, backwards, poor, illiterate, anti-modern, defeated, and guilty also. So one thing as far as these outside images go that you notice is that they also give Southerners a color, and that when you talk about Southerners are racist, the implicit meaning there is that Southerners are white people. Similarly, if you say Southerners were defeated in the Civil War, sort of the implicit message there is that Southerners are white people, that white Southerners were defeated. But there's still this tendency when people say Southerners, what they really mean tends to be white Southerners. So, and one thing, we don't mean to suggest that these negative images are unfounded, because certainly there is a history of racial oppression in the South, which is what we're talking about today. So at times Southern history has been viewed as a burden, and a history that evokes feelings of shame and guilt, especially on the part of white Southerners today. And James Cobb, a historian, has talked about how white Southerners are, he says, quote, identity challenged because of having to deal with this difficult history. So I want to show you a couple of familiar images just so we can think about the racial history of the South before we talk more about the specific research that we did. So, and I also want to warn you beforehand that a few of these images are disturbing as well. I think are important for us to be thinking about the history of the South. So in terms of the South, white Southerners were unique in the institutionalization of slavery on a mass level and in the vigorous defense of the system of slavery. White Southerners were also responsible for institutionalizing a system of segregation, separated both races, vastly limited opportunities for African Americans in the South, and helped white Southerners maintain power and white supremacy in the region. White Southerners throughout history have used violence, intimidation, and fear as tactics of social control over black Southerners. So we can think of the Ku Klux Klan, which historically certainly has been used as a source of fear. And even recently in Lexington, Virginia, there's a recent story about or the resurgence of the Klan or the still presence of the Ku Klux Klan in certain areas. Lynching was probably the most horrific and trying to think of the word, brutal way that black Southerners were controlled through fear. And this is actually an anti-lynching poster that was put out in the 1930s by the NAACP. This was a lynching in Florida, and it was titled, "Do Not Look at the Negro." And one reason this poster was so effective was you can see in the background white children looking at Reuben Stacy's body and smiling for the camera in that case. So lynching was used to incite fear and control African Americans. And then also, white Southerners were unique in their massive resistance, and again, not all white Southerners, of course, but resistance to civil rights. So these are just some of iconic images of Birmingham, the sit-in in Mississippi, and the use of the Confederate flag at that time during resistance to the civil rights movement. So, going back then to this idea of social identity theory, according to Tajfel, he says we're motivated to identify with groups that are positively valued, and that this enhances our self-esteem. So this seems sort of paradoxical when you're thinking about white Southern identity, because on the one hand you have these views from outside the region of Southerners as stigmatized, deviant, poor, illiterate, backwards, and at the same time you have the actual history of white Southerners oppressing African Americans for centuries. So you know, these things, we certainly don't assume that white Southerners today would take pride in that history of racial atrocities, which is in opposition to understandings of American equality. So this makes us wonder then, you know, we arrive at our basic research question of how and why do so many white Southerners, as a group with such a difficult past, still proudly claim this social identity in large numbers, if it's got all of this stigma and this difficult past associated with it. So this study came from a larger study of doing in-depth interviews with black and white residents of the South. This was part of my dissertation work back in 2004 and 2005. So I interviewed roughly 65 black and white Southerners in 3 different cities in the South. I was trying to capture some of the diversity of the South. So Baton Rouge, trying to represent the Deep South. Nashville, Tennessee, more representative of the Upper South, kind of the New South, a booming economy, metropolitan area. And then I also did interviews in a town called Marion, North Carolina. And the only good image I could find was a painting of Marion, but just a small town in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina. So in each town I interviewed roughly 20 people, and I would split the sample by race. So I'd try to interview 10 white Southerners, 10 black Southerners in each town, and tried to vary people's social class, gender, and age in an attempt to have some diversity in the sample along those lines. So ended up with, out of 65 respondents, 59 identified themselves as Southern, and then out of those 59, 30 were white and 29 were African American. So most of what I'm going to talk about is the 30 white Southerners that I interviewed for this study. So one of the things that we noticed in the interviews when white Southerners talked about the past is that many folks used what we term techniques of minimization, which are essentially ways of talking about the past that kind of minimize the racial oppression of the past. So there's sort of three functions to using these techniques. One is to sort of soften the image of racial oppression in the past. Also, these techniques were used to reinterpret the past, to portray white Southerners in a more positive light, and generally to downplay any negative aspects of the South's history and past. So these are the 5 techniques that we noticed when looking at the data. I'm going to talk about each one specifically and give you some examples to show you how folks use these techniques. First one was to assert that racial oppression was not that bad in the South. Second, to assert that white Southerners helped and protected black Southerners. So this is essentially the idea of paternalism. Third, some people talked about, in terms of slavery, the argument that white Southerners did not invent slavery. Fourth, as far as the Civil War, the argument that the Civil War was an honorable cause, as were the soldiers who fought for the Confederacy. And 5, some folks argued that we should just move on and seemed to want to avoid talking about the past. So this first technique, arguing that racial oppression was not that bad in the South, was used by 13 of the 30 white Southerners, so about 43%. Generally, they would assert that racial oppression was not just, but at the same time, it wasn't as bad in the South as people often think it is. And folks talked about this through all different eras in the South's history: slavery, segregation, civil rights movement, using this technique. So this is one example. This is Mark Hobbs from Marion, North Carolina. He's talking about his ancestry, and his family owned slaves at one time. So he said, "My father's home place, it was a plantation. They did own slaves. I'm not proud of that, but I'm not ashamed of it either. I recognize that slavery was a fact of life in those days. A lot of the plantations and slave owners here in the mountains, they had smaller operations. They had a few slaves. They had like one person to work in the house, another person to work in the fields, and sometimes I think you had the owner working alongside with the slave. So in some ways, they were like hired hands on a farm. They weren't hired, but they kind of acted in that capacity." So obviously kind of downplaying the fact that slaves were not hired, were not paid wages, and could not leave the plantation, and talking about slavery as a sort of mutually beneficial system. Also, Paul Madison in Marion talked about his family's ancestry. He said, "We had 167 slaves in the family. See, for us, slavery was a necessity. The reason being, there's no way we could have afforded to live without having it like it was. We respected our slaves, we honored our slaves. And I always find this one interesting because he's sort of clearly saying that in order for his family to have a certain standard of living, then having slaves was a necessity, and not seeming to see that disconnect there with that type of assertion. All right. So these types of arguments that slaves were treated well or that they were respected is a way for white Southerners to alleviate some of the guilt that may be associated with the institution of slavery. The same technique of arguing that racial oppression was not that bad in the South was also used when thinking about segregation by white Southerners. So Brent Daniels of Nashville was talking about when he grew up in Franklin, Tennessee. He said it was segregated totally. In fact, there are probably only 1 or 2 black families that lived in the community here at Franklin, Tennessee. But they were respected people, even though we were segregated. And everyone got along with them. I mean, there were never no racial problems. We had black schools, we had white schools. That's the way life was. And many times during his interviews, he asserted this notion that there were no racial problems. So he seemed to not equate that the system of segregation itself was inherently discriminatory. Other folks didn't necessarily deny inequality, but they talked about having never seen inequality personally when they grew up. So Linda Dobbs, also of Marion, talked about her growing up. So she grew up in the lowland of South Carolina on a tobacco farm. And she says, I mean, it wasn't a people mistreating people situation. I don't remember in my time growing up, I don't remember violence like when these things happen elsewhere. I don't remember that at all. So in these excerpts, you can see a framing of racial oppression in the South as not that bad, not so cruel, violent, or unjust as people often think. So in this way, whites can have a more positive view of their Southern identity by framing things in this way. Another technique that many of the folks I interviewed used was essentially this notion of paternalism, arguing that white Southerners helped and protected black Southerners throughout the history of the South. 10 respondents out of 30 used this discursive technique at some point, so roughly 33%. And generally they emphasize close relations between white and black Southerners, and particularly the paternalistic care that they argued that white Southerners gave to black Southerners. So William Lancaster of Marion talks about how slave owners treated slaves. He said, when slaves got sick, it was the white women that took care of them, got them better. The black children in this area were taught to read and write. Not a lot of Africans knew anything about religion before they came over. The white folk taught them religion. And then kind of moving to a different era, in the time of segregation, you also had this similar techniques of sort of invoking paternalism. In terms of segregation, it was often when white Southerners might talk about black employees of their family, and often use the phrase of those employees being like part of the family. So this is Lisa Harrison from Nashville. She said, I remember my parents thinking it was very important to take care of them as best they could, talking about African American employees. I noticed my mother wanted to make sure that everybody was eating what we were eating, although they might not be eating it off the same piece of china. She wanted them to have ham at Easter and turkey at Thanksgiving. So paternalism is used to demonstrate the generosity of white Southerners towards African Americans. So white Southerners could feel better about their racial past by perceiving their role as one of generosity and articulating the sort of warm, benevolent relationship with their fellow black Southerners. The third technique we noticed was talking about slavery, that some whites downplayed responsibility for slavery by either talking about how white Southerners did not invent slavery or discussing the idea that Africans sold their own people into bondage. And 7 out of 30 respondents, or 23%, used this technique somewhere in their interviews. So this is Bridget Canning of Baton Rouge. She said, well, you know, some black people think that we owe them everything because they were so mistreated. I like to remind them that they came to this country because they were sold into slavery by their own people in Africa. The Indians were here, so if somebody had to gripe that you owed them something, it should be the Indians, not the black. And then also, Brent Daniels of Nashville had a similar sentiment. He said that blacks that were sold into slavery, they were sold into slavery by people of their own families. They were brought here, sure they were, and they were in slavery here, but their own families rounded them up, put them on boats, sent them over here, and many of them died. And certainly that's not good. And then he followed by saying slavery still happens all over the world. So most people who talk about white Southerners did not invent slavery, or there's still slavery all over the world, we're quick to say that slavery was bad, it wasn't a good thing, but you can clearly see a shifting of the blame away from white Southerners, either onto African Americans themselves, or Africans in history, or other groups, instead of taking any culpability or responsibility for slavery. And as you can imagine, the Civil War came up a lot in interviews with both white and black Southerners, particularly white Southerners. A lot of white Southerners tended to perceive the Civil War as an exciting and interesting part of history. 18 out of 30 respondents used different ways or discursive techniques to downplay any potentially negative aspects of the Civil War, and instead focused on what they perceived as more interesting parts of the Civil War. One common way to see the Civil War in a more positive light was that many white Southerners argued that the Civil War was not about slavery, but was instead over states' rights. So out of 29 white Southerners who talked about the cause of the Civil War, 16, or roughly 55%, said that the war was over states' rights. And you can see a real sharp racial disparity there, because out of 29 black respondents who talked about the causes of the Civil War, only one single respondent said that it was about states' rights. The rest of the African American respondents said the Civil War was about slavery. So there's a real difference in views of what caused the Civil War. So Jennifer Dartmouth of Nashville provides one example of talking about the cause of the Civil War. She said, the South wanted to be their own decision maker. They didn't want the North telling them what to do, and if they had slavery, it was just part of our economy. But then it just became about our rights to be who we were and our rights as states. All the men who went to war and died, they just believed this was their home that they were protecting. And they thought the Yankees were taking their homes away, their whole way of life. And most of them didn't own slaves. So you can see she's talking about Confederate soldiers as honorable men. Many talked about Confederate soldiers should be celebrated for their bravery, protecting home and family. And in this sense, by affirming the goodness of Confederate soldiers, it gives one an ancestry that one can feel proud of. So again, this is a way to be able to feel proud about one's ancestors in this case. It was also interesting that several white Southerners pointed out that some blacks fought for the Confederacy and tended to overstate the extent to which African Americans fought for the Confederacy. But the general idea was that if African Americans fought for the Confederacy, then that meant to them that the war was not about slavery. And it was a way to illustrate also that slaves were not really treated that badly, or else they would not have fought for the Confederacy. And one man, William Lancaster, it's a rather long quote, but I'll read it, but he really articulates several ideas very well. So he said that if they, meaning African Americans, would learn more about what their ancestors did during the war, if he read and he found out that sure, he was a slave, but the man that was his owner had taken care of him, had nursed him, fed his family, and clothed his family, had provided a place for his family to live. All right, his master goes off to war. He goes off with him. Would that change the way this black man looked at the Confederate Army or the Civil War, knowing that he didn't have to do that? The first chance he could have took and run off, but he was home. His home was in the Southland. He was basically proud to be from the South, and he appreciated what was given to him by his owner by going off to war. So that also meant that this slave owner was not hanging these slaves, beating them, so he might change the way he views the white people. And it's just education. I'm sure that bad stuff went on back then, but if you look for the good things that happened, like I said, blacks basically built the South, the bridges, the roads. That's something you've got to be proud of. A lot of them don't realize that. So I think this passage is particularly important because you can kind of see him using these different techniques of minimization. First, describing slavery as not that bad, as people often think. And then asserting that he thinks it's better to focus on the good things in the past and not the negative things. So focusing on the good things in the Civil War. And by implication, he believes that African Americans should also focus on the positive and not the negative parts of the history of the South. And then the final technique that 8 out of 30 white Southerners used was some variant of talking about the need to move on or to avoid the past, not wanting to get bogged down in thinking about the past. So there is this desire to avoid the past, to avoid thinking about, dealing with, or taking responsibility for the oppression of African Americans. Some respondents vocalized frustration that black Southerners were, quote, dwelling on the past. These whites believed that blacks needed to stop complaining and take advantage of the opportunities they have now. Brent Daniels of Nashville talked about slavery. He said, "I'm not responsible for slavery. I don't think anyone today is. That's history. I have very strong feeling about people that cry all the time about missed opportunities, and I don't have an opportunity, and continuously provide economic opportunities for me. I mean, God Almighty. I mean, that's all the blacks want to talk about is we're discriminated against. Well, are you? Why play the racial cards all the time? Why do that? That's my question." So this example is, I think, an unusually abrupt and harsh articulation of this sentiment, but it wasn't unusual for white Southerners to say things along this line of, you know, why still think about the past? It's time to move on. So Chris Barkley of Baton Rouge, he's talking about the civil rights movement. He said, "Do I think equality was necessary? Yes, I do. Do I think that African Americans got the raw end of the deal for a long time? Yeah, they did. I'm glad it happened. And now I think everybody's equal and let the best person succeed." Betty Hilgert of Nashville said that she thinks the biggest shame is when people dwell on the negative. They expect some kind of recompense from people who didn't have anything to do with it, talking about the racial oppression of the past. Now, sure, our ancestors, some of our ancestors may have, but they made those choices. And the opportunities we have in this country, I don't want to brush it under the rug, but I just think it's time to just move on. So these respondents all admit that the past was bad, but they see no need to really discuss negative aspects of the past because in their minds, everything's better now. As Chris Barkley articulated, we're all equal now, so folks should take advantage of the opportunities they now have. So in their eyes, yesterday's discrimination has very little bearing on what happens today in American society. All right, so a few conclusions, and then I'm going to turn things over to Brendan to talk a little bit about Black Southerners' memories of the past. Out of a total of 30 white Southerners in the sample, 24, or roughly 80%, used one or more of these techniques when talking about the South's past. Roughly half of all white Southerners, about 47%, used two or more of these techniques when talking about the past. So it appears to us that these techniques serve important identity functions for white Southerners. By viewing the past in a more positive light, portraying white Southerners and their actions as not that bad, there's no need to feel guilt or shame about the past. So they can focus on positive aspects of being white and their white Southern heritage and feel pride in their identification as Southern. So when thinking about this initial question, linked to social identity theory of why do so many whites still identify as Southern, it seems rather simple. If the past is problematic, then you can revise it or rework it or reinterpret it so that that past is not so difficult to deal with. All right, so before concluding and opening the floor to people's questions and comments, Brendan's going to talk a little bit about some more recent research we've been doing, which ties into these ideas about how white Southerners remember the past. So, turn things over to him.
So, recent scholarship on the South has begun to focus on the experiences of Black Southerners as more African Americans embrace and assert their identity as Southerners. In fact, in the same Southern Focus poll that we talked about earlier, Black residents of the South claim Southern identity at higher rates than of white Southerners. Using this more inclusive view of Southerners, we have been working on a research project comparing the memories of Black and white Southerners who were alive during the time of segregation. I want to briefly share some of our preliminary findings with you, as these findings connect with the way white Southerners rework the past to create more positive social identity. We find some striking differences between how Black and white Southerners remember segregation and the Civil Rights Movement. The first is one very apparent difference involved the amount of time that whites and Blacks spent speaking about segregation during the interviews. And for the research that Ashley did, which she had the 65 interviews, and she had to transcribe all of them, so get all typed up and written out and put them into the software where it codes certain phrases. So we looked at civil rights, mentions of the Civil Rights Movement and segregation. And so the output that we had broken down by white and Black, it came out to 207 pages total. And we noticed that Black Southerners talked way more about the Civil Rights Movement and segregation than white Southerners. In fact, 64 pages was given to the white Southerners, and that's only about 31%. But the rest, 143 pages of output, was or 69%, was for black Southerners. So even just when we were starting this research, when we printed it out off the computer, there was a major difference in how much time we would be talking about white Southerners and their memories of segregation, also with black Southerners. Also, a quick mention about the research that we're doing here. The method is a little bit different. We use people that were obviously alive during the civil rights movement and segregation. So it's not the same set, but it is a set that is 22 and 21? So 22 white Southerners and 21 black Southerners. In addition, black Southerners frequently talked about segregation without being prompted in interviews, like a question that would be like, tell us about segregation or tell us about the civil rights movement. These would just come out in the questions these would just come out in the conversation, while with white Southerners, it usually came out when there was a question asked, what were your feelings about the civil rights movement, or what were your feelings about segregation? For example, when Fred Klump of Nashville, who's 58, was asked about the town where he grew up, he said, well, it was a segregated city. I can remember the walk to the back of the bus, the flight of steps that led to the balcony of the local theaters, the separate water fountains, the separate waiting rooms, the separate restrooms. I can remember passing churches I could not attend to worship my God, passing schools I could not enter to pursue admission to the educated men and women, passing playgrounds in which I could not play, restaurants in which I could not eat because of my ethnicity. For black Southerners, segregation and the racial oppression was a central frame used to talk and think about the South. A second thing we noticed was that black Southerners also had much more vivid, detailed memories of segregation in the civil rights movement compared to whites, which aligns with current research which the link between memory and emotions. Emotionally charged events tend to be remembered in great detail. You guys all know that too. Memories of this difficult past for African Americans seem to be stained in the minds of the respondents. A really good example of this is Shonda Murphy, who grew up in Mississippi, and she talks about how she was arrested one day during the civil rights movement. One Saturday, we had all gotten arrested, and they locked us up at the auditorium. And you know those big water coolers? Back then, I can remember them. They were silver. Back then, they used to have an old, big silver water cooler with a spigot in it, and that you get the water out. And they brought it in with a big chunk of ice, and it was hot in the place because it was just children, women, men, everybody just in there. And so we thought, oh, wonderful, we're going to get cold water. And they gave us little cups with the points at the bottom, you know, and everybody was at the water cooler getting a cool drink. And I would say 30 or 40 minutes later, everybody's stomach started to cramp, and we learned that the water had been laced with fleets. It's a laxative, and so everybody had diarrhea. The third thing we noticed was memories of racial oppression played a formative role in black Southerners in the construction of their self and their attachment to Southern identity. Memories of racial oppression were linked to the ideas of strength, perseverance, overcoming hardship, and pride. For example, listen again to Shonda Murphy. When she was asked about whether being Southern was very important to her. Yes, I would say yes, it's important to me. I'm very proud of it, because I think that being reared in the South, I've had to overcome some things. I've had to deal with these issues that other people chose to run from. A lot of people left the South because they did not want to deal with the issues of racism or the things not being quite equal. And finally, the fourth thing that we noticed while we've been doing this research is that many black Southerners seem to want to share their experiences during segregation with the interviewer and to have their experiences recorded for future generations. Some black Southerners explicitly talked about the need to keep memories of past racial oppression alive and keep all their struggles and all their memories alive. Nick Godfrey of Marion, North Carolina. The history that I grew up witnessing, was not good. Would I want my kids to experience it? Hell no. Would I want them to know about it? Oh yes. About the same thing with Amelia Trundle of Marion, talks about the importance of Southern history. As far as my children, and hopefully in my grandchildren, I am looking at it from the black perspective. I think they need to be aware of the struggles that black people in the past had to make for us to have the opportunities now. I think they need to be aware of that and have respect for what took place. It's very important. I think it's kind of getting lost. Unless the parents really stress the past and pass it on, I feel like it's going to be lost in the future generations. And Larry Carpenter of Nashville talks about a generation that came of age during the segregation and civil rights movement and how it actually failed to pass on their experiences. I encounter it all the time in the classroom situation where students simply don't know what happened. And I wonder, where did we fail? Because of those who participated in the civil rights movement are still around, many of us. So why haven't we got those lessons to them? Our examination of the different memories of black and white Southerners suggests two oppositional processes which are at work. White Southerners, as we talked about before, have these, to create a better social identity, have incentives to collectively forget the past racial oppression in order to achieve a positive social identity. However, for black Southerners, it seems a different process is at work. They have incentives to collectively remember the past. For our respondents, remembering racial oppression and struggle is viewed as an obligation, something not to be forgotten. A history must be remembered accurately and passed on for future generations. We see black Southern memory as a moral obligation. We think these two contradictory and oppositional uses of memory may hinder the ability of black and white Southerners to come to terms with the region's past. Our black Southern respondents do not seem invested in just moving on, as many of the whites propose, and that's one technique of minimization. In conclusion, our research, as often happens, leads us to more questions than answers. We're left to wonder how these two groups, black and white Southerners, can reconcile the past when they have different motivations, understandings of the past. When one group is trying to collectively forget the racial injustices of the past, while another group works to collectively remember these same struggles and transmit these memories in future generations. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for us? Yeah.
I have a million. I grew up in Lynchburg. I've spent most of my adulthood in the north, but in recent years I've started to come back down south to work on this issue of our past and our failure to integrate it into who we are in a more honest a way that would allow us to build a different identity as white Southerners. And it's been really helpful or useful living in the north and living with the intricate ways that white Northerners do look down on white Southerners. It's subtle, but it happens all the time. And it's kind of helped me think about the way that, I'll just speak for myself, but I think I, as a white Southerner, spent, many decades kind of enthralled to the past, like really focused on not facing the feelings that it left me with. And I also work in this area of collective memory and between groups and so on. I just think there isn't any hope of reconciliation until white Southerners are able to fill in our history in a more honest way, because as long as we're dedicated to minimization and avoiding it, that's a lot of it takes a lot of psychic energy, in my opinion. That avoidance does. But it keeps us absolutely focused in the past and therefore unable to acknowledge white privilege, the unbroken transmission of our advantages. We can't admit that if we can't admit the past, so we can't work on it if we can't admit it. We'll never have the motivation. So, anyway, that's not actually even a question. It's just adding some thoughts to what you all are saying.
And that seems that last technique of minimization about sort of avoiding the past and moving on is linked to that notion of if you don't think about the past, then you don't think about cumulative advantages for whites and cumulative disadvantages, in this case for African Americans. And so it advantages in the end a group that already has more power in society by not thinking about the past.
I think there's a whole theme of the Civil War between white Northerners and white Southerners. Because I think that's part of where we're all stuck, actually. White people.
And at least there is some sense, and I have not spent a lot of time in the North, but just from other literature, like things that Larry has written about America in general, it can be beneficial to think of white Southerners as sort of the part of where racism is, because then it sort of gives a pass in a way to the rest of the country, or the implication of the nation and, or whites in the nation of racial atrocities.
No wonder we're defensive.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm Doug Harvey. I work at the museum, and glad to have you. I'd also like to invite you to look at the Lynchburg during the Civil War that's in our basement. We made a decision to not refight the battles, but to look at the impact of the Civil War on this community. We also did a snapshot of what Lynchburg was like on the eve of the war in 1860. And Lynchburg is a very complex place with the numbers of African Americans who were slaves, who are also a very large free black population. A lot of slaves in Lynchburg are industrial slaves, but they've been rented out, which gave them more advantages over those who isolated on plantations. But there's a book I recommend to you. The author's name is Stephen Shrimp, and I always get this wrong. It's either, I think, a Southern City Yankee Town, but it's about Lynchburg and how the city was different from many other Southern communities. Very unionist on the eve of the Civil War, did not want to secede from the Union. So Lynchburg in itself is a very, very complex story of race and culture. There's a lot to learn.
Yeah, that's interesting. And the idea of, I don't know a whole lot about slaves being used in industrial settings, so that also seemed unusual that Lynchburg had that part of slavery involved with it.
There's an iron furnace that operated just east of here called Oxford Furnace, and it was almost completely operated by African American slaves. And the owner was down at Petersburg, Richmond, and he often said that he used to send up white overseers if they messed things up. But these people operated everything from complex metallurgy, ran the boats to haul the iron product, and there's some really good research and source documents about Oxford Furnace and slave ownership. There's another one, of course, being listed called Buffalo Forge, called Bonds of Iron by Charles Dew, and it's the same story of the industrial slavery there. One of the things I really liked in that book was when one of their leaders at the Buffalo Forge, when it got hot, the slave that they called Tuller, he basically said, "I'm not working, I'm going fishing." And he went down the river for 2 weeks and took a break. I thought that was good.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? Yes.
In terms of the people who were interviewed, how did you select them? I mean, what's the profile, educational level, and that sort of thing?
I actually brought it with me. So what I did was, it's called snowball sampling, when you start with maybe one person that you have contact with and do an interview with that person, and then ask them for recommendations of other people who might be available to interview. So I would start multiple snowball samples. So for instance, in Nashville, I knew some individuals who were pretty wealthy, so I started one snowball with them to get a little bit of the upper class representation. And then I also knew some individuals who would be more working class, and so I started a different snowball sample with contacts I had in the working class community in Nashville. But there's pros and cons of in-depth interviewing. The good part is that you get a lot more detailed information, and people can tell you stories about what happened, and you can, get a lot more than asking someone like, do you consider yourself a Southerner, yes or no, like in a typical survey. But the downside is that you can't get a fully representative sample, for instance, of the South, because it's such a time-consuming process. So, but essentially I would try to if I noticed that I had a lot of people who were younger, then I would try to find respondents who were older. Or if I had many male respondents, then I would ask people if they knew, a woman who might be interested in doing an interview.
My reason for asking, for example, it had been done in Lynchburg. I would think the answers would depend upon whether or not people lived on White Rock Hill, College Hill, Rivermont. 24503. Right. 24504. So, and a lot of the answers were all of the respondents high school graduates.
Let's see.
Because I would think that they probably were.
There was, let's see, about 11% had a high school diploma or less. But I think it was much more tilted towards, if anything, people who were more educated. So about 30% had some college, 30% had a college degree, but I definitely had more people who had either had some graduate school or a graduate degree. So I do think that's important to, we hopefully want to eventually write this into a more fuller paper, and we would need to discuss some of those social class issues as far as the sample goes. I agree. I definitely think that social class is combined with race too, is very important.
Similar question. Were the people that you interviewed aware of what your research project was?
Yes, actually the interviews themselves at the time in my dissertation, I was focused more on Southern identity, and the very little research had been done on Black Southern identity. It had mostly been this idea that when you say Southerners, it sort of implicitly means white people. And so that's initially why I split the sample. So most of my questions were geared around, do you consider yourself a Southerner? Are there ways you practice being Southern, certain foods you eat? But then I had a section where what we've been looking at came from more questions about your thoughts on what was the most important historical event in the South? Did you participate in the civil rights movement or anyone you know? And so there was a section asking people about the history of the South also.
Did you run across a significant number of people that refused to be interviewed?
That refused to be interviewed?
Yeah. Just didn't want to participate.
There were definitely people who didn't want to participate. I guess it would, but for different reasons. So I had a more difficult time getting younger people to participate. But that seemed to be more of a sort of a time issue and not wanting to sit down for a 2-hour interview about the South when you're 18 years old. But I do remember specifically in Marion, there was an African-American gentleman I wanted to interview, and he specifically told me that he was tired of talking about segregation, and he seemed to not want to be interviewed because of painful memories, and I knew of some public events that had happened in the past with him that he was very much reluctant and ended up not being interviewed. Other questions?
Actually, you talked about some of the questions that were asked. Were there other questions in addition to the ones you mentioned that were part of the interviews?
Trying to think back now.
You talked about two sets of questions. Do you think of yourself as Southern? How do you practice being Southern? And then a set that dealt more specifically with events related to racial history.
And are you asking if there were additional questions?
In addition to this.
I asked some questions that focused around that idea of stigma. So, for instance, do you think that people outside of the South look down on Southerners? Have you ever experienced discrimination because you're a Southerner? Ask people about their accents, and also if they felt that they'd either been advantaged or disadvantaged from accents. So some of those were trying to get at that issue of stigma, though, of outsider views and then how people interpreted sort of larger cultural representations. And then some questions, excuse me, about perceptions of the Confederate flag. And also I asked, I was curious about whites, if they think about their race very often, the importance of their race and that kind of thing. As well. Asked both whites and African Americans, but whites tend to be more taken aback by that question, or to not think as, you know, to say that they didn't really think about race very often.
And how long was the typical interview?
An hour and a half to sometimes 3 hours. It's definitely, when I went to the mountains, a lot of slow talking there, and so the tapes would be very full, but when I would transcribe them, not as much there as, I mean, good things said, but there were long pauses. Yes?
Do you both identify yourselves as Southern?
I do, but...
I'm from outside of Philadelphia. I just came down here for school. That's Thompson.
And, I was born in Winston-Salem, but grew up in Charlotte. Consider myself Southern.
Did you run into people who were ashamed or embarrassed about being white Southerners?
I was thinking there's one younger woman who was kind of conflicted, and then one older gentleman who would not identify as Southern for political reasons. And he grew up, is it in Birmingham that he grew up in? I want to say, I think it was, he grew up in Birmingham. He was lived in Nashville. But he talked about when he was growing up, you know, segregation was kind of a part of life, so he didn't really question it. But then when he went to college, he went to Duke, and the president of North Carolina, it may have been A&T, came and spoke with them, and he really talked about how this speech sort of opened his eyes, and then he very much started to move away from wanting to identify as Southern. He deliberately changed his accent and actually moved out of the South for a while because he didn't want to be identified with the racial oppression in the South. Yes?
How do you think the fact that as an interviewer you were white affected the responses of your subjects?
It varied. I think for whites, whatever their thoughts were, I kind of had you try to just sort of go along. So you know, if someone, so for instance, if someone I interviewed said something that was, you know, completely offensive to me, I would still just say, you know, okay, or so go along. So for instance, some people started immediately by telling me they were bigots and that they didn't like black people, and that's how the interview started. And but I think because I was white, they would tell me those things. I don't think they would have if I was of a different race. I definitely think that sometimes it helped when I interviewed some African American respondents who maybe wanted to, in a way, be able to tell a white Southerner about how things were. But in other cases, I think it hindered our rapport. So that kind of varied, you know, depending. Yes.
In terms of the African Americans interviewed, those who lived through segregation, did you ever pick up the idea that perhaps some of them did not realize how segregated they really were because they were so self-contained in their segregated community, and all their needs were met in their segregated community? So that was my experience. I mean, I didn't realize how bad it was until I left Lynchburg. And I was an adult.
Well, definitely folks talked about sort of the security, like segregation almost made a secure African American community, or at least the respondents who expressed sort of a similar idea. that you had people of different social classes living together, and the schools, if there's a lack of opportunity, then that meant that many of the educators had master's degrees at the all-black schools, and that doctors might be living beside, manual laborers, and that created a sort of different types of social interactions, but a strong sense of community and support, sort of in an ironic or unintentional way. Definitely some folks talked about how, growing at the time, they didn't really think about it because, African and black Southerners as well, that I remember folks talking about, you knew it was wrong, but wasn't something that was constantly going through one's mind. Several folks said it was when the civil rights movement came along that kind of helped people sort of see or notice more when people were working together to create change.
Of the white Southerners that you talked to that didn't minimize, were there some, I'm sure there were some that didn't minimize the past. What did their stories look like? Or when they shared about, the history of the past?
I'm trying to think of a few, generally again, younger, I interviewed a woman in Nashville in her 20s that was pretty progressive in her viewpoints, and so she would, out of hand, say slavery was wrong, segregation was wrong, and it's embarrassing that, this happened in the South. That sort of, so if anything, not being able to understand how that could have happened in the South, but no sense of, trying to make what happened lesser, with these minimization techniques. Trying to think of and I interviewed a journalist in Marion, and she also, similar sentiment, that she was adamantly, that these things were wrong, no excuse, and no attempts to minimize.
Yes, I often wonder, I don't know who was in your study, but I wonder what was the number of those Southerners that identify with being Southerners that have left, moved to other cities, went to northern cities, possibly went out west to California, Arizona, things like that, and what their experience and their identity goes from there. I'm just trying to understand. I'm a New Yorker, so I'm just trying to understand, because I'm a person who has left, traveled to different countries, traveled to other parts of this country, and experienced something outside of a larger city, outside of more than just black and white. And so coming to a southern town, I try to always see what that identity is, and even just try to get that experience. So often wondering, people who are natives, who have gone somewhere where they weren't a native of a town or of a city, of a state possibly, and what their identity is afterwards, and what they even reclaim, collective memory, etc. from there, is very interesting. So I wonder if that was included with any of your respondents.
If so, it would have been very few, but I think that's something that's really interesting, and also, to my knowledge, I don't know of anyone who's really at least been able to kind of do a sociological study of that type, simply because it would be harder to find respondents. But I do recall interviewing some folks that had children or grandchildren who had left the South, and some of them were concerned that the children and grandchildren were losing, the sense of Southern identity. And it doesn't seem, and this is just sort of anecdotal or my impression, that it did not seem to be a lingering identity past a generation or two, but again, that's sort of completely just my impression.
And I would say, coming from an African American experience, we've had great-grandmothers and great-grandfathers that left the South and went north and did extremely well and raised their children north, etc. there was always maybe the Southern identity itself, saying, oh, I'm from the South. We will always say, oh, but my grandmother or my great-grandfather is from North Carolina. It's from Alabama. So we always, coming from an African-American perspective, will always remember that experience coming through, because it's almost like a time traveling experience. And even might not be Southern, but there's still Southern cooking. There's still certain Southern mechanisms with family time on Sunday, going to whatever your worship experience might be together, that, etc. So although it might not be, say, for example, generations removed identity, but it's still very much, I always say, maybe Southern isms or mechanisms. Mm-hmm.
And that's a good point. I think there's been more people are looking at now what you're talking about, like the great migration out of the South of African Americans to northern cities, but still having family ties in the South, like kids coming to the South for summertime to stay with, grandparents or aunts and uncles. And so that's interesting that it has kept alive some of those traditions because family's still in these two different locations. Like I think soul food, has got Southern roots in that, and so there's different things that are still connected based on that.
This question is for both of you. Mm-hmm. Was there anything in your research that surprised you?
I guess just because I haven't studied as much as she has, just to really go in and look at the system of like segregation that kind of still exists down south, just in public schooling. That I'm sure it happened in Lynchburg. I was told just that like a lot of places in the south, like the Christian academies, like opened up. That like once like the schools integrated, then all of a sudden the Christian academies opened up, and that's kind of where the white children would go, and the public schools would be made for the black and African American children. Didn't happen everywhere, but I just kind of noticed that we saw a lot of stuff. This isn't included in our research, but when we were just looking through that in Baton Rouge, there's still like an obvious like parochial schools, like the Catholic schools down there, like the private ones versus the public ones. They're still, you can really see like the color of who's going to those schools. That really surprised me, and that's just nothing to do with this research, but it's still that it's that apparent. I've only been I went down to New Orleans once, and before this was like the most southern I've ever been. I went to Jacksonville, but and so I didn't really know like the actual culture, and so to see that it's still here, and like how can we get past this if there's still groups that are fighting each other, there's still separation. So that was probably the most interesting.
I'd say to me, what was most depressing, I guess, was especially in Baton Rouge. That's where my mom's side of the family is from, so that's one of the reasons I was able to have some context there. But the degree to which there's still so much racism that people would express, whites most particularly, and knowing that some of the folks I interviewed were recommended by my family. And so, for example, there's a family that I interviewed, an African-American family, that my Aunt Camille had driven a school bus with this African-American woman. They had been, co-workers. And to go over to that family, and, we had a fish fry with them and drank beers, and, had my husband and I, and they talked so fondly of my Aunt Camille. And I know when I go to Aunt Camille's house, she would use racial slurs and have a strange, like Aunt Jemima type doll in the corner of the room, and just it struck me of how, in my mind, if you were African American in Baton Rouge, you would never know almost who was being honest or not, because I could see here my own relatives doing this sort of double. I don't know if I'm articulating it well, but it was depressing, I guess.
Well, my question is, it's probably for white people, is how do you reconcile, you kind of left it as reconciling a difficult past, and the African Americans are more willing and wanting to tell their stories and want their stories to remain on, and then you have white people who are not wanting to hear the stories and are saying you should get past that. And I mean, as African Americans, I've heard that personally many times, that, oh, you're dwelling on the past, you just should move on. And so how do you reconcile that? And it seems like it's almost, I'm telling you to get past your history, but I want to celebrate my history and point out the good things in my history to celebrate. So it's okay for me to look back in the past as long as I'm celebrating it, but it's not okay because your past is difficult. And I think and I'm going into a lot more, but I think a lot of African American children, when you talk about history in particular, it becomes very difficult in middle school and high school to talk about and have those conversations, because as African Americans, the history is very difficult. And especially if it's presented very one-sided, then you're celebrating one and you're minimizing another, and it's presented that way. And I noticed as an African American growing up in middle school that it was very difficult to be in a class with other white students and realize that my people were treated this way. But how can you reconcile? How do you have any suggestions that people talk about reconciling that? And I guess it's to the wider audience as well. And how do you see that being reconciled?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer, but I will also look to the wider audience.
I think that when, as a white Southern person, and maybe it must be a lot sharper if you did live through Jim Crow, which I did grow up during Jim Crow here, that when you begin to understand how much this very avoidance is responsible for the continuation of racial injustice now, regardless of how you digest or don't digest the past. The past continues to live in the present in the form of our advantages. I think it becomes of critical importance to do something about it. It's just terribly, terribly important. I don't know. I struggle all the time with my language to sort of encourage other white people to realize, we're going to be so much better off if we do this as human beings, because we're going to be, co-responsible for things getting better instead of responsible for things not getting better. And I really appreciate what you're doing, because I feel like when you lay out the different forms of minimization, it helps me think about how to approach them, not to knock them down, but to sort of just invite, recognizing it's horrible to feel ashamed. It does not kill you, it's not dangerous, and you can get to the other side of it, but you have to feel it first. It's just something we have to do. I don't know how that gets, generalized to more white people, except for those white people who do understand it, to take more, take on our responsibility.
Yes. I think we all have to take responsibility for teaching our history. Unfortunately, we have so many children rearing children. And these children need to understand. I think all of our children need to know our history. All of us. And if it's not being done by families or the schools, maybe their community organizations or the dialogue or whatever, the YWCA.
The museum.
The museum, yes.
Museum education.
The museum should sponsor more lectures and so forth, and it's probably because of Lynchburg was founded by Quakers that we have had such a unique experience in Lynchburg, because at one point there were more free blacks, definitely more free blacks in Lynchburg there were more blacks in Lynchburg than white people.
At one time,
yeah. So we just need, use the museum. Make requests of Doug. He can set up some programs for you.
We have more than one museum that we can use. We have a Museum of African American History.
That's right. That's right.
And we've had it for over 2 years.
Yes.
The museum education is so important as well. You have museums here. You can go to any town. You can go to the national museums in Washington, D.C. and learn about, you know, national history. I even think possibly looking at Southern identity as well. What do Indigenous and Native Americans consider themselves to be? You know, those that have essentially grown up in the South. I mean, let's keep it very honest. We are here in their space. And so for those that are very much proud to be Cherokee and Blackfoot and what are the Native Americans here in this area? Monacans, they're very much active. Do they consider themselves to be Southern? You know, et cetera, and even going into like New Orleans. That in itself is a whole nother subgroup of Southern identity amongst Black people and white people in New Orleans, because that's very interesting in terms of you might have Creole, you have African American, you have French, etc. Black French, white French, you know, can go on and on and on. So that's even possibly some suggestions with furthering your study as well.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson and Brendan. So give them a round of applause. And as you can tell, the dialogue is still needed, even with all of this discussion and everything that's been done. And I will add that we did have Karen Wood come from the Virginia Foundation of Humanities and talk about, you know, history from a Native American perspective. And so hopefully we can have her come back. I do want to add, you know, with all of the energy with this particular conversation, if anyone is interested in continuing this specific conversation, please let me know. Afterwards, there may be an opportunity this week to have that conversation. Aiden Thayer and Sarah Jane, yes, are here, and they are going to be speaking Wednesday night at EC Glass, along with Owen Cardwell and Linda Woodruff, about their experience with the integration of EC Glass schools as it relates to leadership in their experience in their various fields. So Aiden is willing to continue a conversation. At least we may be able to get something together this week if there's enough interest to have more dialogue around this particular idea. What I want to share with you is about some upcoming dialogue events that you may want to participate in. This summer, we're going to have a presentation from the Weldon Cooper Center on the study that they conducted on blacks in Virginia, and that will be in the next 2 weeks or so. We're also going to have our annual summer film series, which will be the third Thursdays of the month beginning in June at Riverview's Art Space, and you'll hear more information about that. And we had a great time last year with showing the films and also having dialogue afterwards. We're also going to, on June 25th, to have a conversation and dialogue on racial profiling, and that will be at 7 p.m. at the library, the public library on Memorial Avenue. And in the fall, again, we're going to have our traditional study circles, so that will be going on. And we're looking to have a dialogue on how to talk to your children about race. And so that's something that will be coming up in the fall. So I just want to thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for your support. And yes. I will try to. I will try my best to get out more timely notices. And I will tell you that one of the events this week, the dialogue didn't plan, but we were just a part of trying to get the word out. So anyway, thanks for coming out. Also, let me know if you want to continue this discussion, and I hope you have a good night.